Officials are offering new details on the death of actor Gene Hackman and his wife, Betsy Arakawa. Both were found dead inside their New Mexico home in February.
The death of legendary actor Gene Hackman was already shocking enough when it first made headlines in February 2025. The two-time Oscar winner, known for unforgettable performances in films like The French Connection and Unforgiven, had spent his final decades living quietly with his wife, Betsy Arakawa, on a secluded estate outside Santa Fe, New Mexico. But months after the tragic discovery inside their remote home, newly released and previously unseen footage from Gene Hackman's mansion just revealed the aftermath nobody expected. You have to see it to believe it. Let's start from the very beginning. The couple and the estate. Gene Hackman had not always lived in seclusion, but in the final stretch of his life, he gradually retreated from public view. By the time he reached his mid-90s, his reputation in American cinema was already secure. Born January 30th, 1930, Hackman's journey into acting was anything but typical. He grew up in modest circumstances in California, left school early, and drifted through a series of jobs before discovering the stage. What followed was a career that lasted more than half a century and transformed him into one of the most respected actors of his generation. He won 2 Academy Awards, first for the raw, relentless performance that anchored The French Connection in 1971, earning the Oscar for Best Actor, and later for his chilling portrayal of Sheriff Little Bill Daggett in Unforgiven in 1992. In between those triumphs, he played the calculating Lex Luthor in Superman, the eccentric Patriarch Royal in The Royal Tenenbaums, and the haunted surveillance expert at the center of the conversation. Away from the cameras, however, Hackman's life was far less dramatic. In his later decades, glimpses of Hackman in public were rare but familiar to locals in Santa Fe, New Mexico, where he lived with his wife, Betsy Arakawa. Their appearances were ordinary: a walk through the farmer's market, a brief conversation with vendors, the small routines of a couple who had built a life far removed from Hollywood's glare. Betsy was not simply Hackman's spouse, but his closest companion and partner. Born December 15, 1959, in Honolulu, Hawaii, she grew up immersed in music and discipline. From an early age, she displayed exceptional skill at the piano. While most children were just beginning to learn scales, she was already performing in public recitals. Teachers and local papers in Honolulu remarked on her unusual composure and technique, and by her early teenage years, she had appeared alongside the Honolulu Symphony Orchestra. Yet as Betsy grew older, her ambitions broadened. Music never disappeared from her life, but she became equally drawn to the idea of building a stable, grounded existence beyond the intense and competitive circuit of classical concert halls. In the early 1980s, she moved to California, joining countless young creatives drawn to the possibilities of the state's artistic culture. Los Angeles in those years was a strange crossroads where actors, musicians, athletes, and entrepreneurs crossed paths in everyday places: restaurants, coffee shops, or gyms. It was in one such place that her life unexpectedly intersected with Hackman's. She was working at a fitness center in Los Angeles when Hackman arrived one day without his membership card. The rules were simple: without the card, entry was not permitted. When he approached the front desk, Betsy calmly explained the policy. His celebrity did not change the rule. She simply refused to let him in. For Hackman, the moment was striking. Instead of pushing back, he began speaking with her. The exchange was brief at first, yet something about the encounter lingered. Betsy had not treated him as an icon of the screen. She treated him as another customer who had forgotten his card. That small moment of firmness created an opening. Over the following months, they grew closer. Despite coming from vastly different worlds, they discovered an unexpected alignment in temperament. Both valued privacy. Both preferred thoughtful conversation to public attention. Most importantly, neither had much interest in the celebrity spectacle that surrounded Hollywood. By the late 1980s, they were spending more and more time together, quietly shaping a relationship that existed almost entirely outside the gossip pages. Friends later described those early years as unusually grounded for a couple linked to the entertainment industry. Dinners cooked at home, long drives through quiet neighborhoods, shared interests in architecture and art, and conversations about what life might look like after the relentless pace of filmmaking. In 1991, after several years together, they married in a private ceremony. The wedding was not a lavish Hollywood production. It was instead a modest gathering attended mainly by close friends and family. Hackman was 61 years old. Betsy was 31. The age gap looked too big to those on the outside. But for the couple, the match was just perfect. Betsy became not only his partner, but the steady center of his daily life. She organized schedules, coordinated appointments, and gradually assumed responsibility for many of the practical details that come with aging. As the years passed and Hackman's memory began showing early signs of decline, her role as caretaker became increasingly important. Hackman often spoke to friends about his appreciation for her steadiness and intelligence. She could sit at the piano and play Bach or Chopin effortlessly, and neighbors would later recall that her laughter was just as memorable as her performances. Their home itself reflected the quiet balance they valued. Situated along Old Sunset Trail in a wooded area outside Santa Fe, the property stood far from the frantic energy of Hollywood. The architecture blended southwestern adobe elements with colonial influences, framed by tall pines and rolling terrain that opened toward distant views of the Jemez, Sangre de Cristo, and Sandia mountain ranges. Architectural publications that featured the residence during the 1990s often emphasized both its elegance and its calm atmosphere. The estate included private gardens, expansive terraces, handcrafted woodwork, and interiors designed to draw in sunlight and music. Years later, when the property would eventually be listed by Sotheby's following the couple's deaths, the main residence was described as roughly 13,000 square feet of interconnected living spaces. There were guest areas, studios, and rooms suitable for entertaining, yet the surrounding acreage created a sense of separation from the outside world. The property was not built like a fortress, but it was undeniably secluded. A gated driveway curved through trees before revealing the house nestled into the hillside. Visitors almost always arrived by invitation. Maintenance workers, caretakers, a handful of neighbors, and a few longtime acquaintances were among the only people who regularly came and went. Most of them later said the same thing. The couple valued privacy above everything else. Security systems were present and modern, but they existed mainly to preserve solitude rather than secrecy. Locals still occasionally saw Hackman browsing the farmer's market for squash blossoms or green chilies. They might notice Betsy walking nearby with a basket of produce, greeting vendors warmly. He talked about books and the weather. She asked about herbs or seasonal vegetables, and for years, this was the story of their lives. Then, in late February of 2025, everything fell apart. The discovery at the Santa Fe estate. Morning came quietly to the wooded hills outside Santa Fe on February 26, 2025. The property along Old Sunset Trail had the same stillness it always carried. Tall pines standing motionless, cold desert air moving slowly through the branches, and a gravel driveway that curved toward a large adobe-style home set deep into the land. Maintenance workers arrived at the property shortly before midday. The visit was routine, but as they drove up the winding driveway that morning, they noticed something unusual almost immediately. The front door of the house was slightly open. The workers paused, uncertain whether the couple was home or expecting someone. The quiet around the house felt heavier than usual. The workers called out, expecting to hear footsteps or a reply somewhere in the large residence. Nothing came back. Within minutes, a call was routed through dispatch in Santa Fe County. Deputies from the Santa Fe County Sheriff's Office were sent to the scene. When deputies arrived, they secured the property and began the first stage of what would become a high-profile investigation. Patrol vehicles pulled into the long driveway. Inside the home, the layout made clear that the couple had been living a quiet and private life. The residence itself was large, roughly 13,000 square feet, according to later real estate listings, with multiple rooms, guest spaces, and living areas spread across interconnected wings. Large windows faced the surrounding landscape. The home was designed for comfort and privacy rather than public display. But on that February afternoon, the focus shifted from architecture to evidence. The bodies of Hackman and Arakawa were located in separate areas of the house. Deputies recorded their positions and began the careful process of documenting the scene. There were no obvious signs of forced entry. Doors and windows appeared intact. Nothing suggested a violent break-in or struggle. Outside, the surrounding property remained quiet. One of the details that soon became clear to investigators was how isolated the home truly was. Although Santa Fe itself has a population of roughly 89,000 people, many homes in the surrounding areas sit on large plots of land, separated by trees and terrain. The Hackman estate was particularly secluded. Long driveways and wooded acreage, OD, created a natural distance between neighbors. That isolation explained something troubling. The couple's deaths had not been discovered immediately. In fact, investigators would later determine that the situation inside the house had likely gone unnoticed for days and possibly weeks. Because the couple lived privately and rarely entertained large groups of visitors, there were few daily interactions that might have raised alarms. The maintenance workers' routine visit was what finally brought the situation to light. Back inside the residence, deputies continued documenting everything they saw. Standard procedure required photographs, notes, and the careful preservation of the environment until investigators and medical examiners could evaluate the scene in full. Each room was checked methodically. Evidence technicians began cataloging details. The discovery quickly drew attention beyond the property itself. Outside, the news began spreading, but inside, the investigation had just started. Inside the house, what investigators found. The first critical discovery was made in one of the bathrooms. Inside, investigators located the body of Betsy Arakawa on the floor near a bathroom countertop. She was positioned close to the vanity area where several items immediately drew the attention of deputies. Sitting on the counter was an open prescription bottle. Scattered around it were individual pills that had spilled across the surface. In many investigations, details like that become key reference points. Deputies photographed the bottle, the pills, and their positions before anything was moved. Near Arakawa's body, investigators also observed a portable space heater positioned on the floor. There were no immediate signs of disturbance in the bathroom itself. Cabinets were closed. Fixtures appeared intact. Nothing suggested a struggle had taken place there. But the investigation did not end in that room. As deputies continued moving through the house, they eventually located Gene Hackman in another area of the residence. His body was discovered in a separate room located near the kitchen area of the home. Like Arakawa, he was found lying on the floor. One detail caught investigators' attention almost immediately. Near Hackman's body were a pair of sunglasses. This suggested that he had been walking through the house or preparing to leave a room. As with everything else, deputies photographed the position of the glasses before documenting the rest of the scene. Investigators began building a preliminary timeline. There were no signs of forced entry. Doors and windows appeared secure. No locks were broken. No glass was shattered. The front door that maintenance workers had initially found slightly open did not show signs of damage or tampering. Investigators found no evidence that someone had broken into the house. Equally important was the absence of evidence suggesting burglary. Valuable items appeared undisturbed. Furniture remained in place. Personal belongings had not been scattered or ransacked. Deputies also looked for signs of physical struggle. There were none. The scene did not immediately suggest foul play. However, one troubling factor remained. The condition of the bodies and the environment suggested the deaths may not have occurred at the same time. However, at that stage of the investigation, deputies did not yet have definitive medical findings. Those would come later from the Office of the Medical Investigator in New Mexico. But inside the house, the scene itself had already begun telling part of the story. Outside, the winter air moved slowly through the trees surrounding the property. The secluded estate that had once served as a peaceful retreat now stood at the center of an investigation that would soon draw national attention. Inside the house, however, the evidence pointed not toward violence, but toward a more complicated and deeply human sequence of events, one that investigators were only beginning to understand. The dogs and signs of time passing. The couple owned 3 dogs. Friends and neighbors had occasionally seen the animals around the property over the years. Hackman and Arakawa were known to be devoted pet owners, and the dogs were part of the quiet domestic life they maintained far from public attention. But on the day deputies arrived, the condition of those animals immediately told investigators something important. Time had passed since the couple had last been able to care for them. 2 of the dogs were still alive, roaming the property freely. The dogs appeared alert but confused, moving around the estate without their owners present. For investigators, that detail mattered. Animals often behave differently when their owners suddenly disappear. Some remain near the home, others wander around the property, searching for familiar voices or routines. In this case, the 2 surviving dogs had apparently been moving around the estate for days without regular feeding or supervision. But the 3rd dog told a more tragic part of the story. Inside the house, investigators discovered one of the animals deceased in a crate. The crate had likely been used as a secure resting area or sleeping space for the dog. But with the couple no longer able to care for the animals, the situation had changed dramatically. Veterinary examiners and investigators later concluded that the dog most likely died from dehydration or starvation. Investigators did not release the exact breed or age of the dog, but the basic timeline helped authorities reconstruct what had likely happened in the days leading up to February 26th. The condition of the animals helped confirm that the house had been unattended for an extended period. Forensic investigations often rely on subtle environmental clues to estimate timelines. Food left untouched, mail accumulating outside, and even plant conditions can offer hints about how long a home has been unoccupied. Police response and released body camera footage. When the first patrol units arrived at the Hackman's estate, their body cameras were already recording. Modern law enforcement agencies across the United States require deputies to activate body cameras during official responses. These devices, typically mounted on the chest or shoulder, capture video and audio during interactions with the public. The Santa Fe County Sheriff's Office began implementing body camera systems several years earlier as part of broader transparency efforts. That meant the entire response on February 26th was documented. As deputies stepped out of their vehicles and approached the house, the cameras captured the first moments of the investigation. The footage shows officers walking up the driveway, speaking with the maintenance workers who had made the initial discovery. The workers explained why they had entered the home and what they had seen inside. Their voices, recorded through the deputies' microphones, carried the tension of the moment. They described finding the couple unresponsive inside the residence and immediately calling authorities. Deputies asked questions, standard procedure during any emergency response. Who had entered first? Which rooms had they gone into? Had anything been touched? These early interviews were important. Investigators rely on first witnesses to establish the timeline of events. The body camera recordings preserve those conversations exactly as they occurred. The footage also documented the physical environment surrounding the house. Wide shots captured parts of the property, the gravel driveway, the adobe-style home, and the surrounding trees that framed the estate. Northern New Mexico's winter landscape appeared quiet and still, with long shadows falling across the ground. The house itself sat partially hidden by pines, its design blending southwestern architecture with the natural terrain. For viewers who later saw the released portions of the footage, one detail stood out clearly. The property was isolated. As deputies moved around the exterior of the home, the body cameras continued capturing everything in real time. At one point in the footage, one of the couple's surviving dogs can be seen moving across the property. The animal wandered through the yard as deputies coordinated their response. But while the body cameras recorded the exterior response and the initial conversations with witnesses, the most sensitive parts of the investigation were never meant to be shown publicly. Once deputies confirmed the deaths inside the house, the property was treated as an active death scene. Additional investigators and forensic personnel were called in. The interior of the residence was documented carefully as part of the official investigation. Body cameras recorded portions of that process as well. However, not all of that footage would ever be released. In the weeks following the discovery, media organizations requested access to records connected to the case. Because the deaths involved a well-known public figure, interest from journalists was immediate and intense. Within days of the February 26, 2025, discovery at the couple's secluded home outside Santa Fe, multiple national news organizations filed formal public records requests seeking access to police reports, autopsy findings, photographs, and body camera footage recorded by deputies from the Santa Fe County Sheriff's Office. Under New Mexico's public transparency law, the Inspection of Public Records Act, many law enforcement investigative materials are normally considered public records, meaning journalists and members of the public can request them once an investigation reaches a certain stage. However, the unusual circumstances surrounding the case triggered a legal dispute over how much information could be released and whether the privacy rights of the family should limit what the public could see. The dispute ultimately landed in the First Judicial District Court of New Mexico in Santa Fe County On March 11, 2025, lawyers representing the Hackman estate, led by attorney Kurt Sommer and estate representative Julia Peters, filed a petition asking the court to block the release of sensitive materials from the investigation. Their argument centered on privacy and dignity. Hackman and his wife, Betsy Arakawa, had spent more than 3 decades living quietly in northern New Mexico, largely avoiding publicity after Hackman retired from acting in the early 2000s. The estate argued that releasing graphic photos, interior footage of the home, or audio describing the scene would violate the family's constitutional right to privacy in death and grief. Lawyers specifically warned that once such materials entered the public domain, they could circulate endlessly online. Initially, the court granted a temporary restraining order on March 17, 2025, pausing the release of nearly all investigative materials while the issue was reviewed. During that period, authorities, including the state's New Mexico Office of the Medical Investigator, were barred from releasing photographs, videos, and some documents tied to the investigation. The order effectively froze public access to the case, while attorneys from both sides prepared arguments. On one side were representatives of the Hackman estate seeking privacy protections. On the other hand were attorneys representing several major news organizations, including the Associated Press and CBS News, arguing that government investigative records should remain accessible under state transparency law. Media lawyers emphasized that death investigations conducted by law enforcement are usually public precisely because transparency ensures accountability. If police investigations remain hidden, they argued, the public has no way to evaluate how authorities handled the case. Gregory P. Williams, an attorney representing media organizations, told the court there was clear public interest in understanding how investigators responded to the deaths and how the case was handled by law enforcement. At the same time, the outlets told the court they were willing to blur or obscure any graphic images if necessary. The final decision came on March 31, 2025, when Santa Fe-based District Judge Matthew J. Wilson delivered a carefully balanced ruling after a hearing that lasted roughly 3 hours. Wilson determined that most investigative materials, including redacted body camera footage, police reports, and environmental images from the property, could be released under New Mexico's open records law. However, he also ruled that any photos or videos directly depicting the bodies of Hackman or Arakawa must remain sealed or be edited out before release. In the judge's words, "There shall be no depiction of either body in any video production or photographic image." Wilson's decision relied partly on constitutional privacy considerations tied to the families of the deceased. In explaining the ruling, the judge referenced legal precedents from other states, including earlier court decisions in California and Washington, that recognized surviving family members' rights to prevent the public release of graphic death scene images. Those cases established that distributing such images could violate the family's due process protections under the 14th Amendment if it caused unnecessary emotional harm or humiliation. By applying similar reasoning, Wilson concluded that the Hackman family, particularly Hackman's surviving children, had a legitimate privacy interest in preventing public display of the death scene photographs. At the same time, Wilson rejected the estate's request to seal the entire investigation. He ruled that documents such as autopsy reports, general investigative findings, and non-graphic photographs could still be released because they fall under New Mexico's transparency laws. The decision created what legal experts described as a mixed ruling. The public retained access to most information about how authorities handled the case, but the most sensitive visual evidence remained protected. The ruling also clarified what parts of the body camera footage could become public. Exterior scenes of the property, conversations between deputies and witnesses, and images of the surrounding environment were allowed to be released. Even footage showing one of the deceased family dogs discovered inside the house could be made public. But any frame containing the bodies of Hackman or Arakawa had to be blurred, removed, or withheld entirely before distribution. Even so, the released footage offered an unusual glimpse into the early hours of the investigation. Viewers could see the deputies arriving, hear their questions, and observe the quiet tension that surrounded the property. The video showed the estate exactly as it appeared that day. A large house standing silent among trees, sheriff's vehicles parked along the driveway, and officers moving carefully through the scene. It also revealed how quickly the investigation unfolded. But what had happened to the couple? The investigators had ruled out foul play. The rest was up to the forensics team to reveal. Medical findings and timeline of deaths. Autopsies and forensic analysis began shortly after the bodies were transported from the property outside Santa Fe. Medical examiners examined toxicology samples, reviewed medical histories, and analyzed the environment in which the couple had been found. Investigators also looked at prescription medications, physical conditions at the scene, and possible environmental factors. The findings that eventually emerged painted a tragic but medically consistent picture. According to the medical examiner, Arakawa died first. Her cause of death was determined to be hantavirus pulmonary syndrome, a rare but extremely serious illness transmitted through exposure to infected rodents or their droppings. Hantavirus infections are uncommon in the United States, but they are most frequently reported in rural regions of the American Southwest, including New Mexico. Public health data from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention shows that the United States typically records between 20 and 50 confirmed hantavirus cases each year. Since national surveillance began in 1993, fewer than 900 cases have been documented nationwide. New Mexico has historically reported one of the highest concentrations of cases because of the presence of deer mice. This species is most commonly associated with the virus. The disease itself can progress rapidly. After inhaling viral particles, often from dried rodent droppings disturbed in enclosed spaces, patients may initially experience symptoms that resemble influenza: fever, fatigue, muscle aches, and headaches. Within several days, however, the illness can escalate dramatically as fluid begins accumulating in the lungs, causing severe breathing difficulties. The fatality rate is high. According to CDC statistics, approximately 35 to 40% of diagnosed patients with hantavirus pulmonary syndrome do not survive. In rural environments where medical attention may not arrive immediately, the illness can become deadly within days. Medical examiners reviewing Arakawa's case determined that her death likely occurred in early February 2025, several weeks before the bodies were discovered. Exactly where or how she was exposed to hantavirus could not be determined with certainty. However, investigators noted that rural properties in northern New Mexico occasionally experience rodent activity, particularly during winter months when animals seek shelter inside structures. While Arakawa's death explained the first part of the timeline, the second part involved Hackman himself. At the time of his death, Hackman was 95 years old and suffering from advanced Alzheimer's disease, a progressive neurological disorder that gradually impairs memory, reasoning, and the ability to perform daily tasks. Alzheimer's affects more than 6 million Americans, according to data from the Alzheimer's Association, and its later stages can leave patients severely disoriented and dependent on caregivers. Investigators concluded that Hackman survived for several days after his wife died. Without Arakawa present to care for him, the situation inside the home likely became increasingly dangerous. Alzheimer's patients in advanced stages often struggle to recognize emergencies, seek help, or even understand changes in their environment. The medical examiner ultimately determined that Hackman died from cardiovascular disease. Heart disease remains the leading cause of death in the United States, responsible for roughly 1 in every 5 deaths nationwide, according to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. In Hackman's case, investigators listed cardiovascular disease as the primary cause, with Alzheimer's disease noted as a significant contributing factor. The forensic timeline suggested that Hackman collapsed several days after Arakawa's death. He was discovered in a room near the kitchen, lying on the floor with sunglasses nearby. The position of his body and the surrounding environment suggested he may have been moving through the house when he suddenly fell. Because of his cognitive condition, investigators believe he may not have fully understood what had happened to his wife. Without outside assistance and living on a secluded property, the situation became a silent tragedy. There were no immediate signs of forced entry, burglary, or violence anywhere in the home. Nothing indicated a struggle or criminal intrusion. After reviewing all forensic evidence, investigators reached a clear conclusion. The deaths were natural and unrelated to foul play. Authorities emphasized that there was no indication of homicide, poisoning, or outside involvement. Instead, the sequence of events appeared to be the result of medical circumstances and isolation. For decades, Hackman and Arakawa had deliberately chosen a private life away from Hollywood. Hackman had retired from acting in the early 2000s after a career spanning more than 50 years. During that time, he became one of the most respected performers of his generation, winning Academy Awards for roles in The French Connection in 1971 and Unforgiven in 1992. But in Santa Fe, he lived quietly. That privacy delayed the discovery of the tragedy. Well, that's it for now. Thanks for watching. Did you like this video? If you did, please consider liking, dropping a comment, and hitting the subscribe button so that you don't miss out on our new uploads. Also, don't miss this video you see on your screen right now. It's truly unbelievable.